I'm not going to read this quote, but it's worth studying, and I could really imagine it showing up in an AP exam. So at any rate, since the Italian Renaissance, painters had struggled to create an illusion of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional plane. It was one of the basic challenges of art. So they employed perspective, chiaroscuro, subtle modulations of color, and by the High Baroque, they had modeling down pretty much pat. And then in the 19th century, we have photography, a process that really accomplishes the same feats using light and chemicals. Yes, it produced art, but it also created a challenge for artists. So we've already talked about the camera obscura and how artists, including Vermeer, used it to help them capture reality in paint. It basically just produced outlines, but it produced quite accurate outlines. Around the year 1800, Thomas Wedgwood made the first known attempt to capture the image in a camera obscura in some permanent form using a light-sensitive substance. He used paper or white leather treated with silver nitrate. He did succeed in capturing the shadows of objects that were placed on the surface in direct sunlight, and he even made shadow copies of paintings on glass, but the images that were produced were very faint, and they didn't last. It was Lumi de Guerre, who's shown pictured on the right, who overcame some of these problems and figured out a technique for fixing an image onto a silver surface plate. It was a very complicated and time-consuming process, and I thought it'd be helpful to get some feeling for this, to understand, what a complex technology this new art form used, so this video will demonstrate it. Boulevard du Pont is the earliest photograph to include people. It's a view of a busy street, but because the exposure time was at least 10 minutes, the moving traffic left no trace. It's disappeared. Only the two men near the bottom left corner, one apparently having his boots polished by the other, stayed in one place long enough to be visible in the picture. After reading early reports of de Guerre's invention, William Henry Fox Talbot succeeded in creating stabilized photographic negatives on paper in 1835. Negatives you all probably don't even recognize, but it was the main way that photographs were captured, up until fairly recently. My husband is actually in the process of taking our old negatives and digitizing them. So it was the technology that would last for well over a century. The process is complicated. Again, I'm only recommending you watch the first minute of this clip, though you're welcome to watch more. But Talbot's most important breakthrough was, again, the use of negatives that could be used to produce multiple copies. So I think it's easy to see from this still life why artists such as Delaroche and Delacroix proclaimed the products of this new technology as art. Many art photographers still like to work in black and white because of the extraordinary way light and shadow play across the surface, and how the three-dimensional illusionistic modeling can be produced by black and white photos. Note, by the way, the very deliberate similarity to a Dutch Baroque Vanitas painting. Essentially, it's a Vanitas photograph, and that's, of course, the kind of comparison that the College Board loves. Now, we're going to encounter more works by realist painter and caricature artist Daumier in my next lecture. But this cartoon is important to the history of photography because Daumier made the print soon after a court concluded that photography was, in fact, art and therefore could receive patent protection. As you might guess, Nadar was the first photographer to use aerial photographs. By the way, I probably should have said copyright and patent protection. What's also notable about the print is that it was made using lithography. Now, your book doesn't really explain this process, even though the term lithography shows up repeatedly on AP exams. So I want you to take this opportunity to watch a very clear and very short video that explains lithography. Photolithography is a process by which images are photographically transferred to some kind of a matrix or substance, either an aluminum plate or, less frequently, an actual stone, and then printed by hand. It's the underlying technology that's used in modern-day photographic or offset printing and is used for a lot of higher quality art prints. So here's Nadar's famous photograph of Eugène Delacroix, who helped photography gain artistic respectability. And here are some other nadar photographs that aren't in your book, but which I really like. Look at how the camera captures the folds, the sheen, even the texture in Sarah Bernhardt's dress. Delacroix, by the way, helped stage this photograph. It was a collaborative effort with a photographer. So note the dramatic lighting, the carefully draped cloth. Again, this is using a photograph to model three-dimensional form on a two-dimensional plane. Note 2, the resemblance to Ingres's Odalisque on the right and the painting on the left, which is also by Ingres. Ingres was really into backs, but also very much on the play of light and shadow on the human body, something that photographs captured extremely well. Photography was, not surprisingly, quickly employed to capture breaking news. So the Crimean War was the first to be recorded photographically, and suddenly a faraway war's bloody battlefields, and even worse, its disease, moved into people's living rooms. They knew what their sons off fighting were facing. This famous photo shows an early operation. This is actually an American photo, an operation that was performed under ether. So note the blurred figures, that betrays motion during exposure, and note the vantage point. This was taken from the gallery above. The aerial view flattens the spatial perspective, and this intrigued impressionists, so stay tuned. Julia Margaret Cameron was one of the Victorian England's most famous portrait photographers. The slightly blurred focus of Ophelia was characteristic of her work. I included the photo of Annie, by the way, both because I like it and because it was the first photograph that she was satisfied with. She was pretty much self-taught, as of course we're all photographers at this point because it was such a new technology. I mentioned that some photographs were taken during the Crimean War, but the American Civil War was the first war that was thoroughly documented on film. This photo by Timothy O'Sullivan is the most often reproduced photograph of the Civil War, and it's a College Board favorite. Your textbook doesn't, on the other hand, include any photos by Matthew Brady, who I think is an even more famous Civil War photographer. I like this one because it shows the curtain of the portable darkroom that photographers had to use until wet plate technology was developed in the 1880s, and, by the way, replaced both daguerreotypes and calotypes. Here's another Matthew Brady photo. I like him, as you can tell. And this photo shows up in the next chapter and on an AP essay. I love the story behind the photo. Leland Stanford, who at this time was governor of California, had made a bet about whether at any point in a stride all 4 feet of a galloping horse would leave the ground. He enlisted the help of a scientist and realist photographer, Edward Muybridge, who showed that, in fact, they did. His sequence of images also helped usher in a 20th century art form, which was cinema. But we're not there yet. In my next lecture, I'm going to look at realist painting, and then at a painting that may mark the real beginning of modernism.